everybody, I am NicoD. So today I'm back with a new SBC. It's the Odroid N2+. So this is the newest revision of the Odroid N2. First of all, I've got to thank my subscribers who have helped me to buy this board. I'm very happy with it. It's again the fastest ARM SBC that I've got, so that is great. So the biggest difference with the Odroid N2 is of course the SoC. They both have got the S922X from Amlogic, but this one has got the revision C, while this one has got the revision A. So what does that mean? The 4 big cores A73 on the Odroid N2+ can be clocked to 2.2 GHz as a base clock and 2.4 GHz as an overclock. While on the Odroid N2, the big cores could only be clocked to 1.8 GHz as a base clock and 2 GHz as an overclock. So 400 MHz faster on the big cores per core, that is quite a difference. So certainly for the single core performance, this board is a beast. It comes closest to the Kada's Vim3. These have got almost identical SoCs. Though the name is very different. This one has got the Amlogic A311D, while this has got the S922X. But Hardkernel likes to overclock their SoCs, so here it can only be clocked to 2.2 GHz with the big cores, while here they can be overclocked to 2.4 GHz. So that makes a little difference, but more is always welcome, of course. So in this video I am going to show you the specs of the Odroid N2+. I am going to show you Linux for the Odroid N2+. There are lots of Linux distros for the Odroid N2. The great thing about these two are that they are compatible. So the software for the Odroid N2 always works on the Odroid N2+, but not always with the correct clock speeds for the Odroid N2+. So not all Linux images are adjusted for the Odroid N2+ yet. But it is good to have compatibility, but that also means that the bad things about the Odroid N2 are also the bad things on the Odroid N2+. So there are many Linux distros for the Odroid N2 and N2+. So there is the Ubuntu from Hardkernel 18.04 and 20.04. There is of course the Debian Stretch and Debian Buster from Meveric. This hasn't been adjusted yet for the Odroid N2+. I will make a later video about that one because I like it a lot. So there is Armbian, of course, Armbian Stretch, Armbian Buster, Armbian Bionic, Armbian Focal, so Ubuntu and Debian. This also is in the works. In a few days or weeks there should be an image available for the Odroid N2+ for Armbian. There is also ArchLinux. I will show ArchLinux with XFCE. It is okay, but there are some bugs of course, and that makes it a little less user-friendly for me. And there is also Manjaro Linux, which is derived from ArchLinux itself. So here we go! I've already told you that the SoC is the Amlogic S922X revision C. So the big cores A73 can be clocked to 2.2 GHz base clock and 2.4 GHz OC. And the two small cores A53 are clocked to 1.9 GHz and the maximum overclock is 2016 MHz. So the GPU is a Mali G52 MP6, so with 6 cores at 846 MHz. I have read posts on the Odroid forum of a guy who had overclocked it to 1 GHz. So it is quite capable. So the whole SoC is a 12 nanometer design. This is great. If you compare that with the Raspberry Pi 4 for example, which has got a 28 nanometer design, then you know this will use a lot less energy, create less heat, while it is a lot more powerful. On the right we see the 40-pin GPIO header. This is fully compatible with the Raspberry Pi. Then we've got the gigabit Ethernet port. Then the HDMI 2.0 up to 4K. Then the worst thing about this board, the 4 USB 3 ports. They all go over one bad USB 3 controller. So the transfer speeds are very bad with it for a USB 3. This is the worst part of this board. This should have been fixed on the Odroid N2 Plus in my opinion. With a better USB 3 controller, the USB 3 speeds would be acceptable, but now they are very bad. I will show them later on. So then we see the 12-volt barrel jack. Then on the back there is the UART debug port, the SD card reader, the infrared receiver. Then we see the eMMC port. Well, you can't see it very well, but it is there. Up to 128 GB eMMC modules. Good that it does have an eMMC slot, because otherwise there isn't much good connection to the board. I don't like running an OS on USB 3 because you can take it out much too easily, or there can be bad contacts and that can mess up an OS. Then we see the SPI switch to boot in SPI mode. Then there is the USB 2.0 OTG port. Good to have this one, because the USB 3 ports give interference with 2.4 GHz Wi-Fi dongles. So for mouse, keyboard or for Wi-Fi, so it is best to use the OTG port for these dongles. And then as last we see the 2.5mm audio jack. The Odroid N2 Plus does have an amazing CPU, but it is lacking a lot of things. So there is no MIPI CSI for camera, no MIPI DSI for an extra display, there is no Wi-Fi on board, there is no Bluetooth on board. There is no PCI Express, no NVMe, so the I/O for this board is rather lacking. There is not that much difference between the N2 and the N2 Plus, except the real-time clock battery is on the board on the Odroid N2 Plus versus a connector for the Odroid N2. The heatsink is a little bit lower on the Odroid N2 Plus, but it doesn't make much difference in heat capacity, because there's only a very little bit less metal on the heatsink. And of course, the Odroid N2 Plus has got its higher clock speeds. Now on to Linux. So here is the first boot of Ubuntu 18.04 Bionic. So the first thing to do, as always, is sudo apt update and sudo apt upgrades. So it booted in 4K, I will have to change that. It also didn't want to upgrade because there was a locked file. You can wait when that happens, but I just rebooted and then did the upgrades. So after the upgrades, the first thing I installed was Genie, and then I opened it with sudo Genie. Then we go to the boot partition and there we open config.ini. Here we can set our display resolution and also the overclock for the CPU. If you want to set your display resolution manually, then be sure to set display auto detect to false. And then you can set the display resolution as you like. So I've saved that and rebooted. So now the next thing to do is change the passwords. So for that just type in passwd. And to change the root passwords type in sudo passwd. Something that is missing in this Ubuntu is the bash autocompletion. So that's when you are typing in the terminal and you push tab that it autocompletes what you are writing. Or it tries to. So to install that, just type sudo apt install bash-completion. Now as usual I add 2 CPU frequency monitors to the taskbar. I also added a shortcut to the terminal and one to the Mati system monitor. And also a monitor for the temperature. Now we can see that the N2 Plus is clocked at 2.2 GHz with the big cores and 1.9 with the small cores. So all that is left to do is overclock the beast. So again we open Genie, sudo Genie, we open the config.ini file and here we set the CPU frequencies to 2400 for the big cores and 2016 for the small cores. And we reboot again. So here is the system monitor. So you can see there is 3.6 GB of memory available, but there is no swap space, no zram. So I will install zram config. To do that, just type in the terminal sudo apt install zram-config. That will give you 2 extra gigabytes of workspace. Certainly when you are opening a lot of tabs with a browser, you quickly get out of space with only 3.6 gigabytes memory. So the zram is very useful on this board. For video playback, Ubuntu isn't that good. So even at 1080p display resolution, 1080p videos don't play perfect. There is a lot of screen tearing. This because there is no VPU acceleration, so the CPU has to do all the work. I've watched a lot of action movies the last days, but this is no way to watch these movies. I've used Android or Core Elec for watching movies with the Odroid N2+, but with Ubuntu it isn't good. Though the video playback with Firefox is a little better. So in YouTube you can watch 1080p 60 frames per second videos. There is a little screen tearing, but for watching YouTube I find that more acceptable, because a lot of YouTube videos don't have that much movement in them. So even at 1440p display resolution you can watch 1440p video in Firefox. One thing I really do not like with these Ubuntus is that there are no drivers for my 5 GHz Wi-Fi dongles. There is no Wi-Fi on board, so you have to use a dongle. So why don't they install all the Wi-Fi drivers by default? In Armbian this works out of the box. There are also no kernel headers to easily install drivers. And another thing is, you cannot set the display resolution in the OS itself. You have to do it in the config.ini file. I think that's an ancient way of working. This should be changed. We should be able to change the resolution in Linux itself. Certainly for gaming this is necessary. If a game wants to use another resolution, then it will not work. Though for this Ubuntu there are no GPU drivers, but there are GPU drivers for the Odroid N2+ for Linux, but they are binary blobs, so produced by Amlogic itself and not open source. But also open source GPU drivers are coming for the Odroid N2, so the future looks bright for Linux gaming on the Odroid N2. So now let's do a NicoD Blender benchmark. So on the left is the Odroid N2+, it is overclocked to its maximum clocks. On the right is the Odroid N2, not overclocked, it is at its base clock. It is just to show the difference between the base clock of the Odroid N2 and the Odroid N2+, its maximum clocks. So the Odroid N2+ did it in 11 minutes and 19 seconds with the overclock, and 12 minutes 21 seconds with the default clocks, while the Odroid N2 did it in 14 minutes 22 with its default clocks. So the Odroid N2+ does this 2 minutes faster with the default clocks and 3 minutes faster with the overclock. So the Odroid N2+ at its default clocks is as fast as a Kadas Vim 3. They are clocked the same, of course. But with the overclock, the Odroid N2+ is 1 minute faster. If you compare it with the NanoPi M4 with the RK3399 at its base clock and the Odroid N2+ at its overclock, then is the Odroid N2+ 2 times faster than the RK3399. That is quite a difference. But if we then compare it with my old Intel i5 2500K at 3.7 GHz quad core, which did it in 4 minutes 15, so it is more than 2 times faster than the Odroid N2+. So ARM CPUs are improving a lot, but they still have to improve a lot more to be able to compete with x86. Do know that the Odroid N2+ uses 20 times less power than my PC. It isn't 20 times slower, so that is great. Here are the 7-zip single core decompression benchmarks. So the Odroid N2+ has done the best score that I've ever seen on an ARM SBC, 2504 MIPS with the A73s at 2.4 GHz. So that's quite a lot. So the single core performance of the Odroid N2 Plus is the best that I've ever seen. That's great for things like DOSBox that only uses one core. For such a performance, this board really consumes very little. So in idle it is 2.2 watts with the CPU maxed out, but at default clocks it only consumes 5.9 watts. And maxed out with an overclock it consumes 6.2 watts. The RK3399 with its base clock already consumes 7.5 watts, and when overclocked to 2 GHz it consumes 10 watts. So this is incredibly low. It is even lower than the Raspberry Pi, while it has got 2 extra cores. And it is clocked higher too. It's a pity it's at 12 volts, otherwise I would take it with me on my trips. But then I would have to buy new 12 volt power banks. Now the temperatures. So here I am doing a 4K NicoD Blender render. This just because it takes a lot longer to do this and to see how high the temperature goes. So it throttles at 75 degrees Celsius. I must say I've done these tests during the hottest days of the year. I expect in normal days or in winter it will never throttle. So it throttles a very little bit when it's overclocked, but when it's not overclocked you cannot make it throttle. 75 degrees Celsius is a very low throttle temperature. This will certainly not damage your board. It takes a long time before it can reach the throttle temperature, so if you are not planning to use it maxed out all the time, then a fan isn't necessary, but if you will use it maxed out, then certainly buy the fan with it. I don't need a fan for it, I'm happy with it as it is. So with the default clocks and the governor on performance, the idle temperature is 40 degrees Celsius. You can lower this if you set the governor on demand, of course. And maxed out with the default clocks it reaches 73 degrees Celsius. So this is on the hottest day of the year, so plus 30 degrees inside. And the idle temperature was 43 degrees Celsius, and maxed out it reached 77 degrees Celsius with the overclock, but it was throttling at 75 degrees. So it still can be used without a fan, so noiseless, that is what I like about it. Only if you live in a very hot climate, then you can use a fan, or if you use it maxed out all the time. But for most tasks, this will never throttle. Then the transfer speeds. So here the Odroid N2 is lacking quite a bit. The SD card reader is okay. 77.8 megabytes per second reads, 28.3 megabytes per second writes. That's okay, but then the USB 3. So I've used an NVMe with an NVMe to USB adapter. And the maximum read speed was 318.9 megabytes per second reads. That is far from the theoretical 400 megabytes per second, what should be possible. And then the write speed is only 215.5 megabytes per second writes. I have done the same test on the NanoPi M4 version 2 with the same NVMe and adapter. There I got 389 megabytes per second reads and 392 megabytes per second writes. So the USB 3 of the Odroid N2 is really bad. There's also just one lane over the 4 ports, so it is saturated really quickly. It's such a pity there is no NVMe or no SATA or no anything else, because this is just too slow to be useful to run your operating system on. As last there is ArchLinux with the XFCE desktop. This looks very nice. This has got a lot of things pre-installed. It has got GPU drivers. You should be able to watch movies with it. But I have got problems with it. I cannot change the display resolution. There is no onboard sound, so not through the jack or not through the HDMI. This because it uses the mainline kernel and not the kernel from Hardkernel. There are still a lot of problems with the Odroid N2 and Odroid N2 Plus in mainline kernel. I hope these will be fixed soon. It is a work in progress, but I am happy to see the progress. So my conclusion is the Odroid N2 Plus is a great SBC because it's got a great CPU, but it is lacking a lot of things. The USB 3 is very bad. It doesn't have got NVMe or PCIe for other connectivity. It doesn't have got Wi-Fi on board or Bluetooth on board. That is something that is really stupid these days. Every other board has got Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. You cannot change display settings in the OS itself. That is so aggravating. It causes a lot of problems. Certainly, for example, with DOSBox or so. If it needs to resize the display, then it can't, so it will hang or it will do something what you don't want. So there are a lot of things that are bad about the Odroid N2 Plus. But the one great thing is of course the CPU. If you do a lot of CPU demanding tasks, then the Odroid N2 Plus is the one to go for you. There is nothing that comes close except the Kadas Vim 3, but that one has got the same problems as the Odroid N2 Plus. Though it has got Wi-Fi on board, but when you use the USB 3 the Wi-Fi stops working. So it is a pity that these Amlogic socks don't have got better I/O. If they would have the I/O of the RK3399 and the CPU of the S922X, then it would be a monster. For me, for desktop tasks, the NanoPi M4 version 2 is still my favorite. The Odroid N2 Plus will be my work beast, to render my videos, to render Blender images, to record my music. So I am very happy with it. So that was it for today. I hope you all liked my video. I've worked a long time on it. Please subscribe to my channel and please share my videos with others so my channel can grow. It isn't doing very well the last weeks. I hope this video will make up for it. So thank you all for watching. See you all later. Bye.